The genesis of a novel. I haven't talked much here about my own novels or my own process of writing. And indeed, these days, I don't really consider myself a writer as I'm not really writing anymore. And I don't think I will write any more books. But I thought I might talk a little bit about how I came to write my first novel, which is called Maybe They'll Remember Me. Without giving too much away, just in case you happen to be one of those very few people who actually read it. I'd been trying to write since at least my mid teens, when I used to compose dramatic poetry oozing with existential teenage angst. A little later, perhaps in my late teens or early 20s, I tried my hand at fiction. These were usually clumsy attempts at science fiction because I loved reading science fiction. But there were also a few more general pieces. I was never able to finish any of them. I continued to make attempts at various times throughout the years, but with much the same outcome. There were some recurring themes in these stories, and even some particular plot points that resurfaced time and time again, and I'm sure some of them are actually in the first book that I was able to complete. And I really wasn't able to do that until the beginning of 2012 when I was 55 years old. I was living in Switzerland at the time. I was engaged in scientific research at the University of Lausanne. My research wasn't going particularly well, and honestly, at times I was just bored, and I thought I would use some of the time I had to start writing more seriously. And I finally made the breakthrough, and I actually completed a novel. And what an experience it was. At first, I had the same difficulties as I'd always had. I would write at a furious pace for a while, the words streaming from my fingers onto the screen via the keyboard. But as always, the well of ideas and words would run dry. This time, though, I didn't give up. Strange things began to happen. Characters that I had considered to be marginal to the story began to assert themselves, and this took me, much to my own surprise, into the years preceding the story that I had intended to write. By the time I'd finished, there was practically nothing left of the original chapters in the story I now had before me. It was entirely new, with fresh and unexpected stars. Two of the main characters of Maybe They'll Remember Me, Harold and Maggie, are loosely, very loosely, based on my parents. That is to say, they lived at the same period. My father did serve on the Queen Mary during the Second World War when he was only a young teenager, and my mother did work in a buttons factory in Birmingham. The family did migrate to Australia during the 1960s. But that's where the facts end and the fiction begins. Maggie and Harold took on lives of their own, and while inevitably they retained traces of their origins, they became completely different people. Indeed, I think there's as much of me in Harold as there is of my father, and many others too. People are very crowded on the inside. Kate, an actress who is Harold's illicit love interest, as far as I am aware, has no historical counterpart. Although, Kate, if you are out there somewhere, please give me a call. One of the great joys I had in writing this novel was in immersing myself in the period. I listened to the music of the era. We're talking mainly about the years of the Second World War and up until the mid 1960s, although there are a few sort of contemporary, i.e., 2011, 2012 scenes as well. I watched clips from movies, I scoured the internet for pictures and stories from those times, I devoured images of the fashions of the day. I tried to make the story as historically accurate and authentic as I could within the context of fiction. I made sure, as far as possible, that the Queen Mary was where I said she was at a given time and place, to such an extent that I let this shape the story to some degree. If the characters saw a movie, or listened to a song, or entered a building, I made sure these things were possible at the time. The plays in which Kate appears were all on at the times and places in which I set them, although, To the best of my knowledge, Kate did not appear in any of them. There's a scene where a V2 explodes on a street in London, and that scene is based on eyewitness accounts. It happened precisely when and where I said it did, though not necessarily to the people who I said it happened to. Digging up these fragments of information was a great delight to me. So maybe they'll remember me was the first novel that I was able to complete. Looking at it now, some 12 years later, I can see that it's very flawed, that it's the work of an inexperienced writer. Some scenes I really like, and some parts I think are really well written, but I would certainly write it somewhat differently if I were to start it today. Nevertheless, I won't ever do that. It is what it is. When my sister read it, she felt that the story of Harold and Maggie might actually have happened. She could imagine it having happened. For both of us, it filled in those lost years that our parents never talked about. It provided answers to the mysteries which we were never able to solve. Although it's fictitious, somehow it felt as though it completed their story and our stories also, to some extent. So there we are, a little background on my first novel. Look, I don't expect you or anyone else ever to read the book, but if you do happen to, I hope you have as much pleasure getting to know Harold, Maggie, and Kate as I did as I wrote them onto the pages.